Now on Daf Tzadi Heyamid Beis, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, we have now Machlokas Shin, Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. According to Rabbi Eliezer, Yochol Dochaku Zovim Umitzorayim, V'nichnasu Lazora B'Pesach Haba B'Tuma. What would be the status of a Zav or a Mitzorah who pushed himself against the law illegitimately into the Azorah? And the Azor apparently has the status of the Machne Shechina, and therefore a Zav, even a Zav, is excluded from the Azora. Certainly a Mitzorah. But now we're dealing with Pesach Haba B'Tumah. The Torah says that if Rov HaTzibur is Tameh, they can bring the Korban Pesach. So on the one hand, we would say, well, what gives you the right to push yourself into the Azora? You have to be sent chutz lemachnos, you should be chayv koris for that. But on the other hand, yochel yechayavim tamilov v'shalchu min amachne kol tzarua v'kol zav v'kol tamil lenefesh. So when the Torah adds these last three words called tamil lenefesh, it means that your status in terms of shiluach machnos, Mr. Zav or Mr. Mitzorah, is that of a tamil nefesh. And and it means that if the Pesach is ba b'tumah, because most of the tzibur is tamei, and that means that tmei mesim, and yet now we're going to bring the korban Pesach, and the tmeim are allowed, tmei nefesh, lemesim are allowed to bring the korban Pesach, is zavin mitzorah, is ein tmei mesim mishtalchim, ein zavin tzorah mishtalchim. So it's only when we have to banish the Tmei Mesim from the Azora. That's when Zavim Mitzorim B'Chai. But in this case of a Pesach Haba B'Tumah, and this is all Rabbi Eliezer, that we only get rid of we expel, if you will, the Zavim Mitzorim when we expel the Tmei Mesim. Now, let's go back to our case. When the people are on a masa, they're on a journey. And we're going to say that, guess what? During the masa, the Tmei Mesim were not excluded because the only reason Tmei Mesim are excluded is because when the Mishkan is stationary in its place, then it has the kedusha of the curtains, right? The kloim, the paroches, and that generates the status of kedushas machne shechina, and the tummy mess is not allowed to enter into the mashla shina. But when the masa brings the mishkan outside, then at that point the machne shechina no longer maintains its status, and that's why, according to Rabbi Eliezer, during the masa, we didn't have to we didn't have to expel the Zavin and the Mitzorayim, and therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it makes sense that if we don't send the Zavin and the Mitzorayim out of the Machne, and they're permitted during the Masa to enter into the Machne Leviyah, and my impression is that there is no Machne Shechina. I don't know. So therefore, we're going to say the following in order to explain the two brisos. The brisa that assumes that the Mitzorayim and the Zavin are expelled, that reflects the sheet of the Chachamim against Rabbi Eliezer, and they maintain that we don't have this equation to the Tamei Mes. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer holds that we have to allow the Mitzorayim and the Zavin because we allow the Tmei Mes. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the top of Daf Tzavadi Heyamid Beis. Achas shtei lechem v'achas lechem aponim lishosan varichosan b'chutz. Right, so we're not up to afia, to the tanur, but as far as all the other preparatory stages, which means kneading the dough, shaping the dough, all that can be implemented outside of the Chatzara Mishkan. And that means there was no Kiddush. And the Pella here is, what do you mean there was no Kiddush? After all, you measured the flour, otherwise known as soles, in a measure, in a kli, and that should be mekadesh the flour. Unless we hold that there's a difference between measures for solids and measures for liquids. Measured for liquids were niskadesh b'kedushas shemen hamishcha, but there was no shemen hamishcha on the measures of solids, and therefore the dough that was prepared chutz lechatzara mishkan, that would be okay, because it never had kiddush, because it was measured by a solid measure. Now, we have to add one point here, that there was no addition of shemen to the soles, because otherwise, if it was shemen, that's already liquid, and that would be measured in a liquid measure, which is definitely, according to everyone, mekadesh. And therefore, it's impossible for the lisha and the aricha, the shaping of the dough, to have been performed outside of the Chatzar Mishkan. Vafiyasam, but now we get to the tanur, and the tanur, although it's used for dry, but nevertheless it has kedushas clay shares, and therefore the baking in the tanur has to be implemented in the Chatzar Mishkan. And now we have to add another point that results from everything we've been discussing. Einon dochos es haShabbos. So even though the mitzvah is to put the lechem upon him on the shulchan on Shabbos, which would give us the impression that we could be docha the Shabbos. Or, for example, the shtei lechem on Shavuos is placed on the shulchan on Yontiv, but that's as far as placing on the shulchan. But the baking of the shtei lechem, or the lechem upon him, which is Afiyah, is one of the 39 melachos, would not override the Shabbos, because you could have easily baked it before Shabbos. And we have a rule, which we're going to get to a little later on, but we touched on it in the past, that anything that could be achieved on Erev Shabbos is not Docha Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, however, Kol Maaseh Bifnim, everything in preparation of the Lechem upon him, whether it be the lisha, whether it be the aricha, and certainly the afiyah, it was all done in the Chatzara Mishkan. The Gemara is going to explain why. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Li Olam Aviragil Lomar, you should get used to saying that Shtei Lechem Lechem Aponim, Ksheros Ba'Zara, U Ksheros bebeis pagi. So Reb Shimon is the opposite of Reb Yehuda. He's saying that even in base pagi, which is way, way outside the environment of the Mishkan, it's somehow somewhere in Yerushalayim, and he holds, Rabbi Shimon, but again, we have to wait to see this, that all the kneading and the shaping and the baking was outside the Chatzar Mishkan because he holds that the measuring cup and not even the oven itself is Mekadesh, which is a Pella. Okay, truth is, as far as the Lisha and Arich is concerned, we said the dry measures, according to this Madi Omar, are not Mekadesh. They didn't sanctify them. But the Tanur, that's a big Chiddush. Okay. So you want to ask Gufa Kasha Amrit, you said Lishos Varichos Bechutz, Alma Midas Yovish Lonis Kadsho. We see that the measuring utensil for dry is not sanctified, and therefore it's not Mekadesh that which is inside of it. And then you said Aviyasam Bifnim, Alma Midas Yovish Niskadsho. I mean, what do you put in an oven if not dry? Omar Rava, Hiksha Adam Kosha Kosha Kibarzel, but Manu Rab Sheshes, but he made a mistake. Even though this kasha was raised by someone as solid, as hard, very hard to answer his questions. He's like iron. And that's Rav Sheshes. Nevertheless, it's not even a kasha. Why? My kasha, why is it kasha? Dilma Yisar and Lo Makadesh, Tana Makadesh. Okay, that which you use to measure anything dry does not consecrate its contents. I mean, it's not Makadesh, that's what's in it, because it itself was never sanctified. But Tanur is Makadesh. Elikasha Kasha. If there was some sort of a kasha that Rav Sheshes had that would register, it's the following: Afiyoso bifnim al matan mekadesh v'yein dochos Shabbos. Now, ein dochos Shabbos means the baking does not override the Shabbos because it could have been achieved erev Shabbos. But that's impossible, because if you baked it on erev Shabbos, and you wouldn't be able to eat it until the night of Shabbos passed, until the day of Shabbos, is if Solei Belina. The apostle we did Lina. Any mincha that was left overnight becomes invalidated through Lina. So therefore, if the loaves of the panim, of the lechem panim, or the shtei lechem, were sanctified before Shabbos, and I prove that from the fact that it's ein adochas HaShabbos, then on Shabbos morning I can't put them on the shulchan because they're already possibly din lina. Oh, my Rava, so Rava laughs at this kasha as well. Hikshadam kashu kakashku barzel manu Rav Sheshes. And here at this point, I get the impression that Rava is validating the kasha. He's accepting the kasha. Omar Avashi, my kusha. Avashi wants to say it's not a kasha at all. Why? Dilma my bifnim, b'makom's reason. No. You know what the word bifnim means? It doesn't mean what we think it means. It's not referring to a place, but to a person. It's not that the bread has to be baked inside the Chatzar Mishkan. Rather, it has to be baked by Zrizim. Who are the Zrizim? Those are the Kohanim. Gemara says that's ridiculous. Hadar of Ashi Brusahi. I cannot accept the logic of Rav Ashi because mimonavshach, no matter how you cut the cake. Iafia be'inon's reason. If you're going to say that you need kohanim for the baking, which is the premise of Rav Ashi, is lishavricha nami binon's reason. Why should you differentiate? Right? You want to make sure that it doesn't become tamei and so forth and so on. You need this reason. They'll supervise. That has to apply even to the lisha of the aricha. The kneading and shaping should require no less diligence than the baking. Whoa. Keep in mind that in the case of lechem aponim, we can't allow it to become chametz. So we certainly need the diligent ones, meaning the kohanim, to make sure that that doesn't happen. And if you're not worried that people might come to be metamayid, is afiyah nami lo beinan's rizim el Rav Ashi berusahi. So what do we end up with now? Right, Rav Ashi was pushing for the fact that the afiyas take place inside the chotzer. What did I just say? Let me say it again. Rav Ashi came to the conclusion that the afiyah could take place outside of the chotzer. That's what I meant to say. That's not true. The afiyah has to take place inside the chotzer, and that's because the tanur would be makadish it. It doesn't override the Shabbos, and therefore it should be possible mishum lina. The Gemara doesn't seem to answer this question at all. All right, so the Tosfos deals with that. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kol Ma'asehem Bifnim, everything that was necessary, whether it's the Lisha or it's the Aricha or the Afiyah, to prepare the Lechem Aponim has to be done in the Chatzar HaMishkan. Rav Shimon says, no, nothing has to be done in the Chatzar HaMishkan. All the preparations were done outside, in Beis Pagi. Omer Avavi Abu Bar Kahana Shnei Mikra Echad Darsh, the Machlokas is about one single pasuk. Regarding David HaMelech, when he spoke to the Kohenei Nov regarding Lechem Aponim, and he wanted to eat the Lechem Aponim, and even though David's not a Kohen, the Lechem Aponim are designated for the Kohenim. For who derech chol? The pasuk says it's derech chol. V'af ki hayom yikdash bekli. So David HaMelech is running away from Shaul. He's starving. He arrives in Nov, and he's pashut dying. And the Kohanim said that the only thing they could give him to feed him, David, would be the lechem aponim. That's all they had to feed him. A very strange scenario. So Rabbi Yehuda holds b'savar b'chol ashkechinu deka'afule. So it was on Friday, says Rabbi Yehuda, that David found the Kohanim and they were baking the lechem aponim lahu, and he said to the Kohanim, derech chol ka'afisule. Af ki hayom yikdash bekli. David HaMelech didn't understand what the Kohanim were doing here. Are the Kohanim baking the lechem aponim on Friday? If that be the case, then if so, lu belina. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, David was arguing that the lechem aponim must be sanctified in the tanur, and if that be the case, then it should be docha Shabbos. Because you have no choice, otherwise it'll be possibly din lina. That's how I understand it. Of Shimon Tzor b'Shabbos Hashkechinu, David found them baking the lechem panim on Shabbos. Dika afule, Amalahu lo derech chol be'isul amivdei. You didn't have to bake it on Shabbos. Midi Tanur Makadesh? Well, you were worried that if you would bake it on Friday, it would become posel midin lina. Shulchan Hu Makadesh, according to Reb Shimon, David HaMelech was arguing that the lechem aponim doesn't become sanctified through the oven, but rather through the shulchan, and therefore it doesn't override the Shabbos. How could you be baking it on Shabbos? Anyway, we see clearly that both Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon hold that we go back to the same pasuk and we have to derive conclusions from that pasuk. Frekta Gemara, how could you possibly say that David came upon the Kohanim and they were baking the lechem upon it? At that time, the pasuk itself indicates that it wasn't at the time of the baking. Vayiten lo hakohen kodesh, ki lo hoya sham lechem, ki im lechem aponim amusarim milufnei Hashem. So David arrives when the old panim, lachmei panim, had already been removed from the shulchan. The new lachmei panim for this week, have not been placed on the shulchan. He didn't arrive when the new bread was being baked. Elamai derech chol dekamalahu. What did he mean when he says derech chol? Hachi kamalahu. This is what David was telling the Kohanim. Leka lechem ki im lechem aponim amusar milifnei Hashem. We know that lechem aponim have to be removed lifnei Hashem. Amalahu, he said to them, Lo mi boy hi. I don't have to tell you about the heter of this bread that had been removed. The cave of the Nafakla, once it was removed, then Mime'ila der Cholhu Elafilu Hech Nami Dahayom Yikdash Bekli Havulei de Lechol Misukan, who you can give it to me because I'm in a life-threatening situation. Rabbi Yehuda, Reb Shimon, Kigemara, Bigemara Pligi, they're arguing about Halacha L'Moshe Misina, it's some sort of tradition. So Rabbi Yehuda received the tradition that the Tanur is Makadosh Lechem, and Rabbi Shimon received a different tradition that it's not Makadosh Lechem. So again, David HaMelech was not talking regarding the baking of the bread. So what is the machlokas? The machlokas, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, about tradition. Dekonami, and I'll prove it to you from a precise reading of the text. Dekotani, it says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Liolam havi rogil lomer shtei alechem v'lechem aponim ksheros bazora uksheros abeis pagi. So we see that they're dealing with tradition. Shma mino. Okay, then we'll stop here, and the mitzvah tomorrow at 9:30.